In 2007, the Defense Intelligence Agency sent a senior scientist to Skinwalker Ranch expecting a routine assessment. What he witnessed that night triggered a secret $22 million Pentagon investigation that stayed hidden for years. But the most disturbing part wasn't what happened on the ranch. It's what followed investigators home. Lights, knocks, pressure changes, even inside their children's bedrooms. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the government classified nearly everything it learned, and why some who stepped onto that land say the investigation never really ended. If you want the stories they tried to bury, subscribe now, because what comes next changes everything. James Lakatsky was not sent to Skinwalker Ranch because anyone at the Pentagon believed in paranormal stories. He was sent because the Defense Intelligence Agency needed a professional skeptic, someone trained to dismantle extraordinary claims, not endorse them. With a doctorate in physics and decades spent evaluating advanced aerospace threats, Lakatsky's job was simple: determine whether the reports coming out of a remote Utah ranch were meaningless noise or something that justified concern. From the DIA's perspective, this was supposed to be routine. Review the site, interview witnesses, inspect the equipment, and close the file. Ranchers had claimed strange things before, so had pilots, soldiers, and civilians all over the world. Most cases collapsed under scrutiny. This one was expected to do the same. When Lakatsky arrived in July of 2007, he was accompanied by security personnel and representatives connected to the property's owner, Robert Bigelow. Bigelow had already spent years and millions of dollars documenting unusual activity on the ranch using scientific instruments rather than anecdotes. Infrared cameras, electromagnetic sensors, radiation detectors, and environmental monitors were already running when Lakatsky stepped onto the land. Nothing was being hidden. Everything was being recorded. The visit was scheduled to last only a few hours, but as daylight faded, Bigelow's team suggested staying through the evening. According to them, the activity intensified after dark. Lakatsky agreed, not because he believed the claims, but because dismissing them without direct observation would have been sloppy science. Shortly after nightfall, while standing near one of the ranch's central structures, Lakatsky witnessed something he later admitted he could not explain. A three-dimensional tunnel of light appeared in front of him. Not a beam, not a reflection, but a solid-looking structure suspended in open air. It glowed yellow-white, extended horizontally, and vanished just as suddenly as it appeared. The event lasted less than half a minute. What made the moment impossible to ignore wasn't just what Lakatsky saw. It was what happened simultaneously across the monitoring systems. Electromagnetic fields spiked. Radiation sensors registered brief anomalies. Temperature readings dropped in a localized area around the phenomenon. Independent instruments, calibrated separately, all reacted at the same moment. For a scientist trained to identify equipment failure and coincidence, that convergence was alarming. Lakatsky spent the rest of the night reviewing the data and questioning the research team. By morning, he no longer viewed the ranch as a curiosity. He viewed it as an active anomaly. And before leaving Utah, he heard something even more troubling. Multiple researchers claimed that after working on the ranch, the phenomena didn't stay behind. It followed them home. When James Lakatsky returned to Washington after his visit to Skinwalker Ranch, his briefing did not sound like anything the Defense Intelligence Agency was accustomed to hearing. He didn't describe folklore, mass hysteria, or unreliable witnesses. He described synchronized sensor anomalies, multiple trained observers witnessing the same event, and data that could not be dismissed as equipment failure. His conclusion was direct and unsettling. Whatever was happening at the ranch was real, measurable, and potentially important enough to justify further investigation. Within months, the Pentagon quietly authorized a classified research effort known as the Advanced Aerospace Weapon System Applications Program, or AAWSAP. On paper, the program sounded harmless, a study into future aerospace threats and breakthrough technologies. In reality, its central focus was understanding the phenomena observed at Skinwalker Ranch and determining whether similar events were occurring elsewhere. The budget was $22 million, spread across roughly 2 years, and almost no one outside a small circle of officials even knew it existed. The contract was awarded to a research group connected to ranch owner Robert Bigelow, a decision that would later raise eyebrows. But from the government's perspective, the choice was practical. Bigelow's team already had years of documentation, active monitoring systems, and direct access to the only known site where the phenomena could be observed repeatedly. Starting over would have meant losing time and whatever opportunity the ranch represented. Once AAWSAP formally launched, Skinwalker Ranch was transformed from private property into something closer to a restricted research installation. Additional sensors were installed, security protocols tightened, scientists, engineers, and intelligence analysts rotated through the site in controlled shifts. Every event was logged, every reading was cross-checked, environmental baselines were established so natural explanations could be ruled out before anything was labeled anomalous. The goal was not to prove the paranormal, it was to eliminate every conventional explanation until nothing remained. And over time, that's exactly what began to happen. The phenomena did not behave like weather, geology, or electromagnetic interference. It appeared sporadically, responded to observation, and refused to repeat itself under identical conditions. Some nights were quiet, others produced events that triggered multiple sensors at once. Even more troubling, AAWSAP investigators began confirming reports that Bigelow's team had quietly documented for years. The effects didn't end when researchers left the ranch. Personnel who spent time on the property began reporting strange disturbances back home, sometimes days or weeks later. The pattern was consistent enough that program leadership could no longer ignore it. By the end of its first year, AAWSAP had reached a disturbing realization. Skinwalker Ranch wasn't just a place where anomalies happened. It was something that initiated contact, and that contact didn't stop when the investigation did. The moment AAWSAP personnel began rotating through Skinwalker Ranch, a troubling pattern resurfaced, one that Robert Bigelow had quietly warned about years earlier. The phenomena did not remain confined to the property. Instead, it appeared to attach itself to people who spent time there, following them back into their private lives long after they had left Utah. The first confirmed off-site incidents came from trained investigators who understood how easily coincidence and misinterpretation could distort perception. These were not casual reports. They were documented, repeated, and in some cases, measured. One researcher reported that within 24 hours of returning home, he began hearing sharp knocks coming from inside the walls of his house. The pattern was unmistakable. 2 quick impacts, a pause, followed by a heavier third strike. It was identical to a knocking sequence he had personally recorded while working at the ranch. Environmental checks found no explanation. No pipes, no HVAC systems, no structural weaknesses. Contractors confirmed the house could not physically produce sounds with that force or rhythm. Yet the knocks continued, sometimes occurring several times in a single day, sometimes disappearing for days before returning without warning. The timing matched nothing natural. More disturbing were reports involving family members who had no knowledge of Skinwalker Ranch or the investigation. Several AAWSAP personnel described their children seeing brief flashes of movement, shadow-like shapes, or unexplained lights inside their bedrooms. Others reported sudden drops in temperature localized to specific rooms, or pressure changes strong enough to make ears pop, as if altitude were shifting indoors. These accounts emerged independently from families living in different states, in homes with no shared construction or environmental factors. One DIA analyst who spent less than a single workday on the ranch experienced some of the most severe effects. Within a week of returning home, motion sensors inside his house began triggering without cause. His children described lights moving through rooms when electronics were unplugged. His spouse, who knew nothing about his assignment, independently reported strange sensations and sounds that mirrored reports coming from other investigators' homes. What alarmed AAWSAP leadership was not just the events themselves, but their unpredictability. Time spent at the ranch did not correlate with severity. Some personnel worked there for weeks and reported nothing. Others experienced immediate and intense disturbances after only brief exposure. There was no way to predict who would be affected, when it would begin, or how long it would last. As interviews expanded, even individuals who initially denied experiencing anything unusual began recalling small anomalies they had dismissed. Doors left open, electronics activating on their own, fleeting visual distortions. Once those moments were documented and compared, the pattern became undeniable. Skinwalker Ranch was no longer just a research site. It appeared to be a point of initiation, a place where contact began but did not end, and that realization forced investigators to confront a far more dangerous possibility. This was not a localized phenomenon. It was something that traveled with people, crossing state lines, families, and private homes without permission. Once AAWSAP investigators accepted that passive observation was no longer enough, the focus of the Skinwalker Ranch study shifted. If the phenomenon appeared to react to human presence, then controlled interaction might reveal how it operates. The team began designing experiments meant to eliminate coincidence, contamination, and human interference entirely. What followed pushed the investigation beyond anything normally associated with anomaly research. One of the most significant tests involved a sealed environment experiment inside a secured trailer. Researchers placed a small table at the center of the trailer and scattered children's jacks and a rubber ball across its surface. The setup was deliberately simple. The trailer was sealed with tamper-evident locks, monitored by motion sensors, and filmed continuously by cameras placed both inside and outside the structure. Environmental conditions were logged down to minor fluctuations. There was no physical way for anyone to enter, touch the objects, or manipulate the scene without being detected. When the team returned hours later, the scene inside the trailer had changed. The jacks, which had been randomly scattered, were now grouped neatly by color into organized rows. The ball had rolled from one end of the table to the other. No alarms had triggered. No seals were broken. The air pressure, temperature, and humidity remained stable throughout the test period. The cameras showed no visible intrusion and no movement that could account for the rearrangement. The experiment was repeated with stricter controls and additional monitoring. Sometimes the objects moved. Other times, nothing happened at all. The phenomenon appeared selective, refusing to perform on demand. That inconsistency became just as important as the successful trials. Random environmental forces do not choose when to act. Other experiments produced similarly unsettling results. Sudden flashes of light appeared in sealed rooms, often disabling cameras immediately after recording them. Narrow bands of freezing air moved through enclosed spaces with surgical precision, unaffected by ventilation or airflow. Electromagnetic spikes occurred only while measurements were actively being taken, then vanished the moment equipment was powered down. The conclusion was unavoidable. Whatever was interacting with the researchers was not passive. It responded to observation, adjusted its behavior, and avoided capture. Skinwalker Ranch was no longer behaving like a natural anomaly. It was behaving like something that knew it was being studied and did not want to be understood. As AAWSAP continued documenting events at Skinwalker Ranch, the investigation quietly crossed a line inside the Pentagon. What began as an attempt to understand unexplained phenomena was now raising questions that went far beyond science. The issue was no longer what the phenomenon was. It was what it could do and whether it posed a threat that existing security systems were never designed to handle. From a defense perspective, the most alarming development was the off-site activity. If something encountered at Skinwalker Ranch could follow investigators home and manifest inside private residences, then distance offered no protection. Several AAWSAP personnel held high-level security clearances and routinely worked inside classified environments. The obvious question emerged: if the phenomenon could appear in a suburban home, what prevented it from appearing inside a secure facility? That possibility forced leadership to consider scenarios no intelligence framework could comfortably address. If the activity represented an advanced surveillance system, one capable of tracking individuals across state lines without electronics, signals, or physical devices, it would surpass any known human technology. If a foreign adversary possessed such a capability, it would represent a catastrophic intelligence failure. Russia and China were quietly evaluated as hypothetical sources, but the theory quickly unraveled. The phenomenon had been reported in the Uinta Basin for decades, long before modern aerospace or surveillance breakthroughs were possible. That left a more unsettling explanation. The phenomenon might not be human at all. This hypothesis was deeply uncomfortable for officials, but increasingly difficult to dismiss. The behavior documented by AAWSAP showed awareness, responsiveness, and selectivity. It reacted to observation. It adapted when experiments changed. It targeted individuals rather than locations. These were not traits of weather systems, geological activity, or electromagnetic interference. They were traits associated with intelligence. Briefings prepared for senior officials emphasized the same conclusions again and again. The phenomenon was real. It was measurable. It exceeded known technological capabilities, and its origin and intent were unknown. Worse still, it demonstrated the ability to interact with human environments in ways that bypassed physical security entirely. AAWSAP leadership warned that continuing the investigation carried risks that could not be quantified. Personnel were reporting psychological stress. Families were being affected. There were no protocols for protecting people once exposure occurred. Participation in the program meant accepting unknown long-term consequences, something no agency could ethically mandate. At that point, Skinwalker Ranch stopped being a scientific mystery. It became a liability. The Pentagon now faced an impossible dilemma: ignore the phenomenon and risk missing a genuine threat, or continue investigating and expose more people to something they could not control, predict, or contain. And that dilemma would soon shape a decision that permanently changed the course of the program. By 2010, OWSAP had reached a point the Pentagon was not prepared to handle. The program had had produced years of data, witness testimony, and experimental results that pointed to something genuinely anomalous, but none of it fit neatly into existing military or intelligence frameworks. The investigation wasn't yielding a weapon, a countermeasure, or a clear technological breakthrough. Instead, it was producing questions that senior leadership had no way to answer, much less explain to Congress. Officially, AAWSAP ended because of budget constraints and shifting priorities. That explanation was technically true, but deeply incomplete. Inside the Defense Intelligence Agency, the program had become increasingly difficult to justify. Briefings to senior officials were uncomfortable. Analysts struggled to condense findings into slides that wouldn't sound absurd to decision-makers unfamiliar with the data. Describing a phenomenon that reacted to observation, followed people home, and avoided detection did not translate into actionable intelligence. Oversight pressure also mounted. Congressional staff began asking where the money was going and what measurable outcomes the program had produced. AAWSAP's defenders argued that identifying unknown phenomena was the outcome, especially when those phenomena demonstrated capabilities beyond known technology. Critics countered that the research sounded like paranormal speculation and carried no obvious military application. In a tightening budget environment, programs that could not clearly define their value were the first to be cut. Internal disagreement worsened the situation. Some officials believed AAWSAP had uncovered the most important intelligence mystery of the modern era and deserved expansion. Others saw it as a dangerous distraction that risked damaging the agency's credibility. Leadership turnover only amplified the divide, as new decision-makers inherited a program they neither approved nor fully understood. But the most decisive factor was liability. By this stage, multiple personnel had reported continued disturbances long after their work at Skinwalker Ranch ended. Some described anxiety, sleep disruption, and stress linked directly to unexplained activity in their homes. Families were affected. Children were affected. The government had no framework for addressing or compensating consequences tied to something it could neither define nor control. Continuing the program meant accepting responsibility for unknown risks that extended far beyond the workplace, and that was a risk no agency could formally accept. When funding expired, AWSAP was quietly dissolved. A much smaller follow-on effort continued under a different name, focusing narrowly on unexplained aerial phenomena and advanced propulsion concepts, stripped of the ranch, the off-site effects, and the most controversial findings. Monitoring at Skinwalker Ranch was reduced, personnel were reassigned, and almost all of the program's reports, data, and conclusions were classified. The investigation didn't end because it failed. It ended because what it uncovered created problems the system was never designed to face. Although AAWSAP officially ended in 2010, the conclusions it reached did not disappear with the funding. Inside classified channels, the program reshaped how the U.S. government viewed unexplained phenomena. The investigation established several points that could no longer be dismissed as speculation. First, the activity associated with Skinwalker Ranch was real and measurable. It was not the result of faulty sensors, exaggeration, or misidentified natural events. Independent instruments repeatedly captured anomalies that violated known physical expectations. Second, the phenomena displayed behavior that appeared responsive and adaptive. It did not manifest randomly. Activity often increased when monitoring intensified and diminished when observations stopped. Experiments rarely repeated under identical conditions, suggesting the phenomenon was not governed by fixed mechanical rules. This alone separated it from weather systems, geological effects, or electromagnetic interference. Third, investigators concluded the phenomena demonstrated capabilities beyond known human technology. Instant acceleration, localized environmental manipulation, and apparent interaction without physical contact were all documented. These characteristics placed the activity outside any known aerospace or defense platform. Whether it represented a future technology, an unknown natural force, or something entirely non-human remained unresolved. Perhaps most troubling was the conclusion that the phenomenon was not bound to location. AAWSAP data showed that exposure, not geography, mattered. Individuals who spent time at the ranch experienced effects later in unrelated locations, sometimes thousands of miles away. This finding fundamentally changed the investigative model. Skinwalker Ranch was no longer viewed as the source, it was the point of contact. These conclusions directly influenced follow-on Pentagon efforts. Later programs studying unexplained aerial phenomena adopted AAWSAP's data standards while carefully avoiding its more controversial associations. The government did not abandon the subject, it narrowed it, rebranded it, and buried the most disruptive implications under classification. Years later, fragments of AAWSAP's work began surfacing. Scientists like Hal Puthoff discussed aspects of the research in limited public forums. James Lakatsky later co-authored a book confirming the government's involvement, though key details remained redacted. These disclosures confirmed what insiders already knew. The investigation validated decades of reports rather than debunking them. AAWSAP didn't solve the mystery of Skinwalker Ranch. What it did was far more unsettling. It proved that the mystery was real, intelligent, and not confined to one place, a conclusion that still shapes how the government approaches the unknown today. When AWSAP was shut down, the public assumption was that the government had lost interest in Skinwalker Ranch. In reality, interest never disappeared. It simply changed form. What ended was the structure of the program, not the concern that had created. The findings were too disruptive to vanish. They were instead absorbed into classified channels where the most unsettling conclusions could be managed quietly. Internally, the government accepted that Skinwalker Ranch had never been the true problem. The ranch was not a container holding the phenomenon. It was a trigger, a place where interaction began. AWSAP data showed that once exposure occurred, distance no longer mattered. Time no longer mattered. The activity followed individuals into their homes, their families, and potentially their workplaces. That single realization redefined the entire risk profile. From a policy standpoint, this created an unsolvable issue. You can restrict access to land, you can shut down facilities, you can terminate contracts, but you cannot contain something that attaches to people rather than places. Continuing the investigation meant knowingly exposing personnel to an unknown variable with no countermeasures, no protective protocols, and no way to reverse its effects. That reality made long-term study ethically and operationally impossible. Years later, fragments of the truth surfaced. Former officials cautiously confirmed the existence of the program. James Lakatsky publicly acknowledged that what he witnessed at the ranch could not be explained within known physics. Other researchers admitted the off-site effects were real, documented, and deeply concerning. Still, the majority of the data remains classified, not because it was trivial, but because it challenged foundational assumptions about reality, security, and human control. The most disturbing conclusion AAWSAP reached was also the simplest. The phenomenon did not behave like a force of nature. It behaved like something aware, something selective, something that responded when observed and withdrew when studied too closely. Whether it represents non-human intelligence, an unknown aspect of reality, or a system humanity does not yet understand, remains unresolved. AAWSAP did not end with answer. It ended with a boundary the government refused to cross again. Skinwalker Ranch became a lesson rather than a project, proof that some investigations don't fail because they lack evidence, but because the evidence forces questions no institution is prepared to answer. And if the phenomenon truly follows people home, then the most unsettling possibility remains unanswered. It may not be finished with us yet.